Welcome to SPRingBoard. I'm your host, Michael Hannaman, and today we're tackling one of the most pressing and complex challenges facing New York City and other communities across the country: how to build more affordable housing and where to build it. At a time when the demand for housing continues to outpace supply, policymakers and developers are increasingly looking to underutilized and historically industrial properties, known as brownfields, as opportunities for redevelopment. In New York City, this is playing out in neighborhoods like Gowanus, where 2021 rezoning has spurred a wave of residential redevelopment alongside ongoing environmental cleanup efforts. But transforming these sites raises a host of questions. How do developers manage the costs and risks of remediation? What role do programs like New York State's Brownfield Cleanup Program play in making environmental remediation and affordable housing construction financially viable? And how do evolving policy tools, like the new 485X tax incentive, reforms to the State Environmental Quality Review Act, known as SEQRA, and the city's broader housing strategy shape what ultimately gets built and at what scale? To explore these questions, I'm joined by two guests who are deeply involved in this work. Justin Pelsinger is a partner and the chief operating officer at Charney Companies, a real estate development firm that has been at the forefront of redeveloping brownfield sites in New York City, particularly in Gowanus. Michael Bogin, a principal here at SPR, also joins us. Michael has extensive experience advising developers on brownfield redevelopment, with particular emphasis on affordable housing and on hazardous materials remediation and all aspects of environmental regulations and permitting, including navigating the Brownfield Cleanup Program. Together, we'll discuss how brownfield redevelopment is shaping the future of affordable housing, the legal and financial frameworks driving these projects, and the practical realities of building housing on some of the most complex sites in the city. Justin and Michael, welcome to SPRingBoard.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Our topic today is affordable housing and the challenges and opportunities involved in redeveloping underutilized properties for residential use. Michael, can you start by describing for our listeners what a brownfield site is and why, practically speaking, these sites are candidates for redevelopment into housing?
Sure, I'd be happy to tell you about that. A brownfield site, generally speaking, is just a previous industrial site that isn't currently being used for its best purpose. And in New York City, and actually nationwide, when we're in the middle of, I think, a recognized affordable housing crunch, a brownfield site represents a supply of potential housing. It's a site where housing can be built on a property that is currently not being used for its highest and best use.
And Justin, can you tell us a bit about Charney Companies' development work? And I know you and Michael Bogin have worked on redeveloping a number of brownfield sites in New York City, so you could tell us a bit about how you came to do so much brownfield redevelopment.
Yeah. Well, Charney Companies is a fully integrated real estate firm that is developer, general contractor, property manager, leasing agent. So we're a fully integrated firm, and we are one of the most active development firms in New York City. And we look around for sites that make sense for us to develop. And one of the areas that we targeted was the area of Gowanus for a whole host of reasons. One was the rezoning that was happening there, the ability to build rental housing, the fact that it had an overlaid opportunity zone. And we really felt it had the bones of what was going to be an emerging neighborhood that was going through and will be going through and continues to be going through a massive transition. But one of the things that comes with developing an area like Gowanus is that it is highly in need of environmental remediation. And because they're all designated and require remediation, you naturally find yourself in Brownfield. And almost every site under redevelopment in Gowanus is in the Brownfield program. If it's not in there now, it will eventually be put into the program, or at the very least, if it's not in the program, essentially by default be under Brownfield regulation and requirements. So when we targeted that area, naturally, we became a developer that had to deal with some of the more complicated remediations in New York City. And that just kind of daisy chained to more sites. We bought one site, which was Brownfield. And then because we were having so much success in the neighborhood, kept buying more sites there. Naturally, what ended up happening was we didn't just end up accruing a large ownership stake in a neighborhood for residential housing, but we also accrued a wide amount of experience with remediation, right? So it wasn't as though the goal was to just target brownfield sites. It's kind of like what ended up happening by virtue of the fact that we were targeting this neighborhood. And I think that going through it, we've learned, like we do with many things, is that it's really valuable to kind of have nuanced knowledge of how to navigate complicated situations in New York City, and I think brownfield and remediation is one of those things, right? Highly complicated, highly nuanced, requiring specialty knowledge, not just from us as developer or a construction person, but from environmental attorneys like Michael, environmental consultants, and the sort. So I think that it's been, I don't know, 6 years, 7 years now that we've been in this area. And I think, 7 years later, we find ourselves as somebody who has probably remediated some of the more complicated sites and also more sites than many other developers in New York City.
Mhm. Great. Yeah. So you brought up two things I want to spend some time digging into, which is both the Gowanus neighborhood and the Brownfield cleanup program. Most people, I think, know the Gowanus Canal as a federal Superfund site. The canal was added to the Superfund priorities list in 2010, and the cleanup of the canal is currently being conducted under the oversight of EPA. But as you mentioned, Justin, separately in 2021, the city had rezoned the Gowanus neighborhood, which has prompted this sort of ongoing transformation of the neighborhood from industrial to residential and mixed-use commercial. And the remediation of those properties, as you mentioned, it's not being done under EPA because they're not part of the Superfund site, but under the auspices of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the city's Department of Environmental Protection. And as a result, Gowanus is really one of the most, I think, complex brownfield environments in the city. And you mentioned the Brownfield Cleanup Program. So, Michael, can you tell our listeners a bit about New York's Brownfield Cleanup Program and why the program is important to these Gowanus sites?
Sure. So the New York State Brownfield Cleanup Program is really unique in that it offers significant tax credits to developers who are willing to undertake the risk of developing a brownfield site. That program came into being in about 2003, and it has morphed several times over the years, scaling back the tax credits especially for properties in New York City. But one of the ways in which it has continued to provide opportunity to affordable housing developers is by allowing affordable housing developers, even in New York City, to access what they call the tangible property credits. But these are tax credits that are a function of the amount of money that's spent in bricks and sticks and mortar in developing the real estate. And the tax credits are tied to the percentage of the housing stock on your project that's dedicated to affordable housing. So it becomes a key financial incentive, but something that sometimes gets lost is it's also a key certainty and financeability program. And what I mean by that is, look, affordable housing development is complicated without brownfields. There are numerous agencies that are involved if you're trying to get affordable housing financing, in addition to just the regular difficulties of building in New York City with investors and partners. And what the Brownfield Cleanup Program does is it puts a regulatory framework in place that a lender or an affordable housing agency can look to and rely on in knowing that the property will be cleaned up for the intended use as a residential housing project and that it will be safe to be used for that purpose. That's incredibly important from the lender perspective, just putting aside the tax credit benefits that you get from it. And so that certainty in remediation is something that sometimes gets lost. But when you put those two factors together, provide one of the most important opportunities for developing affordable housing on brownfield sites.
Great. And you've already mentioned this a bit, but I just want to draw out the point. How does the Brownfield Cleanup Program help incentivize the development of affordable housing on these sites and not just housing?
So what it does is up until 2015, any housing that you built in New York City, actually any kind of project that you built in New York City, you had access to these tangible property credits, which are based on a percentage of what you spend developing your property. And there were certain caps that that came in that are a function of how much you spent on cleanup. But to simplify it, if you were building anywhere in New York State, you got tangible property credits that were a percentage of what you spent on that real estate development. Starting in 2015, that changed, and the legislature said, "Hey, listen, New York City, it's too rich. Like there's too many people developing and it's costing the state too much. And so we're going to scale that back. But what we're going to do is we're going to offer a gateway to remain eligible for that tangible property credit if you build affordable housing. But we're not going to give you 100% of that benefit. We're going to give you that benefit to the extent of your percentage of affordable housing that you build on any site." So for a lot of rezonings, the mandatory inclusionary housing component of it is you have to build at least, let's say, 30% affordable housing. So fine. So for every tax credit dollar that you would otherwise be eligible for in New York City, instead of getting the full dollar, you get 30 cents on the dollar because that is equivalent to the affordable housing percentage that you're providing. On projects that are financed through, let's just say, HPD, which is the Housing Preservation and Development Department, those are 100% affordable housing projects. And so for that, dollar for dollar, you get the benefit of the tangible property credit. And that's a significant incentive. It's not as significant of an incentive as, and Justin can tell you, let's say 421A was, and other tax credits that may be available, but it fits into that capital stack that you're going to be looking at when you invest in an affordable housing development.
Great. So, from a developer's perspective, Justin, what made developing in Gowanus an opportunity for Charney Companies, and how integral was this tax credit for affordable housing units through the Brownfield Cleanup Program in deciding to build in Gowanus and what to build in Gowanus?
Yeah. No, I mean the brownfield program for a lot of sites, especially in Gowanus, is often a thing that pushes it over the edge to be able to be developed, right? Because there's a certain amount of cost that you're going to get back that you're going to spend on remediation. And it's also a little bit of a hedge because remember, you don't always know exactly the requirements for what is going to be laid on you to actually complete the remediation. So you're putting together your best estimates, but if it ends up adjusting, you need to know that at least a portion of that is going to be coming back to you. It's highly crucial in the underwriting of these deals, and it's no surprise that everybody is using them in order to develop the area. So I would say that every single one of our deals in Gowanus has brownfields. We're highly relying upon the tax credits that we get for them, and I don't know if absent those credits, how many sites are able to actually move forward given the uncertainty with the remediation themselves.
Yeah, and we'll get in a bit to talking about the other tax incentives for affordable housing, 45X, which replaced 421A. But because Gowanus is also one of the more complex brownfield environments in the city, I want to talk a bit about what that has been like in terms of cleaning up the actual contamination, the soil, and the groundwater there. So could you speak a bit about how Gowanus is either similar to or different from typical brownfield sites, and how so?
Well, I mean, Gowanus is different in several ways. I think the first and most important one is it's immediately adjacent to a federal Superfund site, which is the Gowanus Canal. So that immediately adds a layer of risk in developing there that just doesn't exist in most other places, especially not most other places in New York City. In fact, when the rezoning happened and you were permitted then to develop residential properties along the Gowanus Canal, I know that there is no other place like that in New York City. Even though Newtown Creek is also a Superfund site, there's no residential housing being built on Newtown Creek yet. So someday it may be more similar to Gowanus Canal, but it's not there yet. So that's the first and most important difference. Second key difference is the type of contamination, and it's primarily the one that is of the most concern to DEC and EPA is the manufactured gas product, coal tar waste that is just ubiquitous underneath the entire neighborhood and underneath the canal. And for decades, that contamination was known, but was not addressed. And I think part of the reason why is because there was not a lot of residential development, but also because there are so many MGP sites across New York State that once you open that box and start saying we need to deal with this waste, it's a major undertaking for property owners, but also for the State Department of Environmental Conservation. They now need to dedicate an immense amount of staff effort to dealing with MGP sites. So the combination of the rezoning in Gowanus, which created the opportunity for residential development, and this long-standing and well-known, but not previously regulated MGP waste, when you put those things together, it really changed the dynamic and how to clean up a property. And frankly, DEC was learning on the fly, as were developers like Justin and Charney. And in fact, Charney happened to be on the cutting edge of how to deal with MGP waste remediation, especially on properties that weren't the source of the MGP waste itself. And Justin can tell you some of the trials that we went through, but that was unlike any other brownfield site that I've dealt with, which are more typically just historical fill that has some, coal ash and other types of semi-volatile contamination, even some dry cleaner sites that have chlorinated solvents. It was totally unlike those because this was a kind of waste at a depth that we never had to deal with before and DEC never had to deal with before. And so it was very much learning on the fly for DEC.
And how did that play out for you, Justin? What are some lessons you learned from your work remediating Gowanus and remediating this sort of coal tar waste?
Yeah, I think we learned a lot of things that are very specific to Gowanus. To Michael's point, early on in the development of this area, there's a bit of a process working with the agencies to actually develop what it is that actually has to be done. So I think it's interesting to do so much brownfield work and kind of get your, kind of the foot in the door to complete all of this work on a site that is not traditional, right? A traditional site would have been call your attorney, call your environmental engineer, and give them the data of what the site has, and then they will just tell you what you're going to have to do. Here, there was, I think it's almost fair to say a bit of a partnership in the sense that you're working with the agency to help develop what it is that actually has to be done because there is so much nuance to the type of work that had to go on. So I think we learned a lot about that process with working with the agency to develop what actually has to be done. And I think we also learned that not every site is made equal. We learned that slowly because each site that we were purchasing didn't have the same exact set of circumstances. And I think after building so much in the neighborhood, we ended up learning the characteristics of what a site would have to have in order to produce a remedial action work plan that made sense for that site. So it wasn't until, we had completed one site that had soil removal to proper facilities, your more traditional SSDS, like systems like that, to then going to something more complicated and then developing things that were more nuanced within the complication to then start to look at sites that were like a mixture of both to see, okay, well, I see what it's like if you have one site that has not a lot, another site that has a little bit more, I see what it's like if you have a site that has a mixture of both. I see what it's like if you have on the waterfront. So then from that, I think we were able to take away from that. I understand the way in which the agency is thinking about this. I understand how to kind of develop this plan because now we went through this process with them to say, okay, this is what the standard is. This is what the gold standard is for actually achieving this. And you can give me any site in the neighborhood, and I would have a very strong feeling as to how we're actually going to do the remediation. Whereas 7 years ago, there was a bit of this back and forth working. So I think we've learned no site is made equal. And we've learned that you got to really be speaking directly with the agency as early as humanly possible. And you got to really leverage as much history and background of what other people are doing. And if it hasn't been done or there's not great precedent, we've learned that you're probably going to be developing the precedent. And you're going to have to work with the agency directly to kind of do that.
And I would add to that, Justin, what we also learned is that learning process and that partnership is time consuming. If you're dealing with an established type of contamination and an established type of remedial methodology, let's just say, you got a little bit of petroleum, DC knows how to clean that up. We know how to clean that up. The consultants know how to clean that up. And it's like a very standardized process. And so it doesn't take very long to get the authorizations that you need. Here, with each step, there was, I think, at DEC, a justifiable need to discuss internally how they were going to deal with this. And with the State Department of Health, did they think this remedy would suffice? And some of the remedial technologies were and still are untested. And so how do you test them? How do you measure their success? Getting the answers to those questions is time consuming. And time is maybe the most important aspect of any real estate development, but especially in affordable housing development, where there are so many parties who are engaged in financing of that development and seeing it go forward. And how do you explain to all of those various parties, some of whom are other governmental regulators, that you're working through this, but it's going to take more time than I think anybody initially anticipated.
So you mentioned the project timeline and how things, depending on the complexity of the site, of the type of contamination, it can slow down the process of getting through the Brownfield cleanup program. In your experience, Michael, where in the process do sites tend to slow down the most, and what can be done to help speed up the process while still adequately remediating the contamination that exists?
Developing the remedial action work plan and getting to what they call the decision document, which is the agency's determination that your remedial action work plan is acceptable to the agency, and I should say the agencies, DEC and the State Department of Health. That's the most time consuming piece. It was especially time consuming in Gowanus because of the novelty of dealing with MGP waste. But it's time consuming on every project, especially any project that involves the potential for soil vapor intrusion, because the Department of Health plays a significant role and they need to evaluate that risk and how to mitigate it. The way to shorten that process is something that the state and the regulated community is discussing right now, because the state is also cognizant of this issue. And the state has, and the governor has made clear that the state has an agenda to advance affordable housing. So how do we make that time frame shorter so that it works with, for example, closing on financing with HPD or with HFA, federal housing agency? How do we get that to work more efficiently so that we don't miss the closing deadlines, which rely on having that decision document? That's what the agencies need in order to move forward with the closing. I think the easiest way is to do, frankly, what we're doing right now, to talk to each other. And that is something that used to be not even something you would think about. It was just done routinely when I started in this practice. And it is not routine at all anymore. I think some of that is a function of COVID and not having face-to-face meetings the way that we used to. But I also think some of it just has to do with younger project managers who are now starting to come into the ranks and then will move up through the ranks, who've grown up in a world where the way you communicate is through text messaging and Teams or Zoom. And that needs to change. There needs to be more person to person communication, either on telephone or in meetings. And it can be accomplished through Teams too, but it needs to be scheduled, it needs to be regular, and it needs to happen. And that is something that the state recognizes and certainly the regulated community knows. And we're working on that and other mechanisms that could shorten, especially that time frame between the remedial action work plan, and getting the regulators to approve it.
Something I want to draw out from what you just said, which I think might not be so obvious for people who are not already immersed in this work, is that often what draws out timelines the most is not the actual cleaning up of the contamination. It's the pre work, it's the planning, how you're going to do it. And it's especially the coordination between agencies and the people in those agencies and the developers and the lawyers to get everyone on the same page about how their remediation will be. You had mentioned just a bit ago, Justin, that not every brownfield site is the same. Thinking about both the type and extent of contamination, but also these more, I guess, coordination, administrative aspects of remediation. What for you as a developer, when you're looking at a site, makes it seem viable for redevelopment, especially through the Brownfield Cleanup Program, or what might make a site seem not so worth pursuing?
I think the time is always a factor. And I think that if it's a site that has had zero work done as far as the remedial investigation goes, they're really starting from square one or even zero. Um, I think we need to be very realistic with ourselves as to how long it's going to take. And to Michael's point, it's not always about how long is it going to take for me to remediate the site. Because sometimes the remediation of the site is kind of part of your normal construction schedule. Like if the remediation itself was excavate and dispose of soil to proper facilities, we're talking about excavation that would have occurred either way. What we're really talking about is not a speed of remediation. I mean, maybe it's a little bit slower for some testing that has to be done every time you kind of remove soil, but really what we're talking about is a cost thing. We're talking about how much more expensive it's going to be to get rid of that soil, the run cam, to do all the recording and things like that. I get less concerned with that. What I get more concerned about is it going to take me 2 years to even get to the point where I can take the soil out of the site? And if it's going to take me 2 years, then I need to look back at my underwriting and not just include into it the cost of doing the remediation, which is going to be more expensive. I have to also think, okay, if I'm going to acquire the site, when am I realistically going to start? When am I going to have to put in the capital? Is this deal now not a 4 or 5 year deal? Is this a 7 year deal? Like what are we really talking about here? And the timing does matter as far as the complexity of the remediation, because sometimes you get to a site and you know that in order for you to get through that phase, there's going to be a lot of testing and step off borings and all sorts of stuff. And it's not necessarily to the fault of the agency, as though, yeah, I mean, there are things that can be done to speed up that process that hopefully the agency, the private sector are going to look at to kind of do together. But some of it is just like the nature of needing to get the data, right? And the data just sometimes takes time to get. And you're not always, doesn't always make sense for you to just day one, just say, okay, I'm just going to drill 150 borings everywhere, right? And delineate the site down to 100 feet everywhere. So that I have like the perfect visibility on every single thing on this site, because that would cost a crazy amount of money. You're not necessarily even getting credit for doing that, right? So the amount of time that it takes to get to that is really crucial of whether or not we're even interested in a site or not. And obviously, if they haven't done anything, not only am I concerned with the time, I'm also concerned with what are we even dealing with here, right? How do I get comfortable that based off of a phase one and based off of like some surrounding site data that I even have a picture of what this site's going to look like. So we definitely think about that a lot. It's why when you have sites of a certain type during either a contract period or pre-contract, you're asking, can you do some more investigative work more so than a phase one, right? Can I actually drill? Can I actually get some more data out there? And it's also why I would say that I think some sellers of sites, when they know that they have a site that is dirty, they might not do that extra bit of testing because they're kind of hedging a little bit. Like, well, maybe there's a buyer who doesn't appreciate the nuances of this, right? But I think that, listen, there's always somebody that you might fool, right? They don't really realize that this is so complicated and so hard. So maybe you win out on that. But I do think that, especially in very sophisticated markets, the second somebody gets on a call with somebody like a Michael or right, some expert, they're going to realize that there's a lot of unknowns here. So I think we've also looked at other sites where the seller has had actually a lot of really good data. They've really started that process. And for me, that doesn't just give me more comfort that I should even buy the site. Maybe I'll even pay them a little bit more because I can actually underwrite the remediation to a much more specific degree than sort of like, who knows? I have to be so conservative with this
Right.
that like the amount that I'm going to offer you just might not make sense for you anymore because I'm not taking the risk. You're going to essentially take it. And so like it's a battle over who's taking this risk, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about when I'm looking at sites that are potentially going to have remediation.
Another aspect of Gowanus is that it's been really front and center in the public attention for a while. And I know the local Gowanus community has been very engaged in the remediation and the redevelopment issues. And, built into the Brownfield cleanup program process are opportunities for public review and comment of certain documents, such as the remedial action work plan that says how you're going to remediate the site and to what level. I'm curious, Justin, in your experience, what the community's primary concerns have been, and what are some best practices that you've learned in Gowanus for engaging with residents and businesses in either before or during the redevelopment process?
Yeah, I think that we really love the Brownfield program because we think that we love the idea that we get to remediate sites that needed to be remediated and are underutilized. So it's just who doesn't like that story, right? These are sites that had we not done this, they would have continued to live as they were and not had anybody step in and actually clean them up. Right. So we love that. And I think we also know based off of going through the process with the DEC, and OER, and the fact that EPA is coordinated with DEC, that these sites are getting remediated to the highest of highest standard. So we are so involved with this and we're so aware of the process that not only do we like the fact that it's remediated, but we like the fact that it's getting remediated to a level that you couldn't even imagine, right? So I think then when we're engaging with residents, we want people to know not just that the story is great, right? This is a underutilized site that went through revitalization, and in that sense, it's an amazing kind of experience. But we also want them to know that this has been signed off by every agency that you can possibly imagine. The amount of remediation was done is beyond anything you can even fathom. It's just like any other site now, right? But I think at the core, it just gives us a lot of pride that sometimes you get to build housing, right? And sometimes you get to build housing that comes with it with environmental benefit. And sometimes you get to build housing with environmental benefit that also has affordable housing, right? That has social benefit. And these are also fully electric buildings. And some of them are going to have public parks. And I think you don't always get given the opportunity to make such an impact. And I think we do our best to articulate that if we're asked.
So, zooming out from Gowanus and out from the Brownfield Cleanup Program, I want to talk a bit more about affordable housing more generally. And one of the things that you mentioned a bit earlier, Justin, are the affordable housing tax incentives. Currently, we have 485X, which is a tax incentive that New York State implemented in 2024. which provides a real property tax exemption for construction of new multifamily dwellings that set aside a certain percent of affordable units, which replaced the previous program called 421A, which expired in 2022. From your perspective as a developer, how does this 45X tax incentive program compare to the old program in terms of incentivizing the building of affordable housing units?
There's been a lot of conversation about 45X, its shortcomings and its benefits. For people that don't know, it's a tax abatement program that's similar to 421A, which is a real estate tax abatement program. For building a portion of your building as affordable housing, you get a real estate tax abatement for a certain period of time. Um, the shortcomings with 45X is that as buildings get bigger, you have much higher wage requirements, which is why you're not seeing a lot of development get done under 45X in the larger scale. Um, we're hopeful that maybe there'll be adjustments on that. It's being studied, but I think that the 45X prevailing wage requirements are essentially what's stopping larger developments from moving ahead. And you're seeing lots of 99 unit buildings that don't require the prevailing wage requirements. We don't have any projects that are 45X, frankly. All of our sites are 421A. They're historical 421A. They're actually similar to 45X in that the affordability requirements are the same.
Right.
The permanency of the affordability is actually the same. Gowanus is actually pretty similar to 45X. It's almost near identical to 45X, except for the wage requirement. It's just interesting to kind of see that in many ways the Gowanus redevelopment legislation is almost like the um, best example of what 45X would look like had it not had the wage requirement, because that is essentially what it is. It's 45X without the wage requirement, even though it's called 421A. So I think that listen, you're not gonna see as much getting built under 45X. You'll see a lot of small projects, and hopefully there'll be some change in that, but I'm not sure when that will occur.
So, Michael, can you provide our listeners with a bit of context about the wage requirements in 485X and how that might be shaping design decisions about the kinds of buildings that get built?
I mean, I'm not the person to be asking specifically about the wage requirements, but what I have definitely seen is that on several already underway brownfield sites, meaning that properties that have already been accepted into the program. And when you apply to the program, the application asks you to explain what your development is going to be, and to give some what I call sketch plans of what it's going to look like. I've seen several of those projects that have pumped the brakes, stopped, and now are retooling to build in where you had maybe two or three or even one very large building. Now there's three or four or six or eight 99 unit buildings. And I am not an expert on building efficiency, but everything that I've seen tells me that that's not the most efficient way to build, period. And especially not on a brownfield site. I don't know how it's all going to turn out, but I think Justin is right. If, the Gowanus model, which was a singular piece of legislation that effectively extended 421A for Gowanus, uh, I think that model is something that the legislature and the governor's office is looking at and should be seriously considering as let's just call it as a tweak to 485X. Because I think I said at the beginning, look, the Brownfield cleanup program is really important. I mean, it provides a level of financial and environmental certainty that no other program can. And that's very important in affordable housing development. But I still think that in comparison to 421A, 485X, at least on the financial end, it's not nearly of the same scale.
And let's say that the prevailing wage requirements of 45X remained as is, even though it sounds like you both are in agreement that those should change to incentivize more affordable housing units in each project. Justin, are there other aspects of affordable housing construction that could change to help reduce the administrative or financial costs of delivering more affordable units in the city?
I think it's being studied. Everybody is always focused on how do you build more efficiently and more cost effective. To the credit of the current administration, they had a speed task force. They've been listening to people as to like what they can do. And they are attempting to do some stuff, like the SEQRA stuff to expedite environmental reviews for sites that maybe feel like they don't need such a elongated process, some permitting review process. They're doing as much as they can, but I think if you look at a deal's budget, you'll realize that over 70% of the costs are really coming from acquisition and hard costs. And the hard costs, the construction costs are really the most. A lot of times almost 50% is really just construction. So I think that then we sometimes look at these sites and say like there's only so many toggles we really have. It's really, really hard to build projects cheaper. If we could, we would, right? We're not in the business to build things as expensive. We're building as cost effective as we can for the type of quality we want to build. And I don't think you want to take buildings down to like really poor quality. You're trying to find something that fits the needs of the people that were going to live in the building. And with so much production tied to global economics that we in New York City have no part of, is challenging to figure out how to bring costs down. I think that people talk about, can you build modular? Can you do more construction offsite in warehouses and things that can kind of really have the effect that you need to have? Because how is somebody in New York City, especially in government, going to change the cost of steel or the cost of plumbing fixtures or sheetrock or whatever it is, right? We don't control that. We don't control interest rates. Interest rates just are what they are, right? We don't control the view of whether or not developing is risky or not risky and whether or not there's capital that wants to be in the market. So there's only so many things that can be changed. But people are studying as much as they can. And I think that the biggest thing that they can change, which is speeding up the actual permitting process, approval process, sign off process on the back end, those things help. I just don't think that they're like massive, massive changes that will kind of overcome a poor tax abatement program, right? Because I think that if you can't change hard costs, then you're left with land. And then if the land costs get so cheap that the existing seller doesn't want to sell, then you're stuck. So that's kind of the tricky thing that goes on with development. And I think a lot of people forget or assume that developers or those that are building buildings just own land. Well, we don't own land. We own a business that wants to go buy land and then develop them, right? And we have to have two parties involved in that transaction. So we have to find a seller that is willing to actually sell us a site. And I think sometimes when you look at areas like Gowanus in particular was a great example, but what you have is if a seller feels like that is worth their while to sell, and a buyer feels like based off that price, they can embed all the programs they need to embed and build something that the capital markets find attractive, well, then you have like a marriage, right? You have somebody who wants to sell, somebody who wants to buy, and the person that wants to buy can raise the capital properly from the financial markets so that they can go do that based off of like the whole transaction. When you have a break in that chain anywhere, you have no movement. So when you add too much cost on one end, it can only be taken away from land. And therefore, if it gets too cheap, nobody wants to sell, and therefore nothing happens. If you bring costs down enough, maybe land will be high enough that you can convince somebody to trade. And maybe somebody will trade eventually, but it might take 10 years for them to realize it's worth it. So I think that's why I like rezonings. I like rezonings, especially rezonings that increase the value of the land more than it's been historically, because it incentivizes a seller to say, I want to transact. And I really like when that happens and it increases the value to a point that it's so much higher that I can also embed all these amazing social services or social needs that, we as society kind of wants. So I can say, okay, you've increased the land value so much that now I can build affordable housing, or I can do remediation, or I can build um, a rental building instead of a condo building, or name all the things that it just kind of feels like we all agreed should be getting done in society. And if I can embed those things and it's still at a price that the seller is willing to sell, then you kind of have this amazing kind of public-private partnership that goes on. I think that's what you're seeing in Gowanus. And I think that this is where some of the disconnect ends up happening. I think a lot of legislation and politicians kind of focus on, they sometimes avoid the fact that many of us are in agreement, right? Many of us are already in agreement that we want more housing, and many of us are in agreement that we want more affordable housing. Many of us are in agreement that we want more green type of buildings and more electric buildings, and we want more, retail. And we're on parks, like the vast majority of people are in agreement on that. We sort of start to disagree or find the issue with like how you make that happen. If you can kind of allow those things to make sense in the under the constraints of the free market, then you can have magic happen. And I think that's just generally what you're seeing in Gowanus. You're seeing a rezoning, it increased land prices, embedded all these amazing requirements in it. And it was all those requirements still allowed somebody to pay for land beyond what it was ever worth. So like you have like a whole neighborhood getting built with all these amazing things happening. And it's all being done with no public subsidy money from any of the state city agencies. It's just a tax abatement, which that's how historically everything is getting built. So when you unleash the free market, great things happen. When you attempt to kind of force things that go very contrary to the way the free market's going to work, a lot of times you just get stagnation and just kind of nothing happens.
Yeah, so just to put, some of these, recent sort of reform efforts on the table, which it sounds like to you, Justin, are sort of, and maybe addressing things at the margins in terms of how you think as a developer, where the hard costs of development and land and market forces really shape what gets built and where. But you mentioned SEQRA, and the New York State Legislature very recently reformed the State Environmental Quality Review Act, which we call SEQRA, which is the law that requires agencies to undertake environmental review before approving, funding, or taking discretionary actions. And those reforms will exempt certain housing projects from environmental review if certain criteria are met. Recently, Mayor Mandani of New York City also released a sweeping affordable housing strategy, which commits to building 200,000 new affordable homes, preserving 200,000 existing homes in the next decade. And that built upon another report his administration recently released called the Speed Report, which had advanced a number of initiatives to cut timelines for affordable housing projects. These things could constitute an entire podcast episode, and we only have a few minutes left. But I want to just put these on the table to ask, from your perspective, Michael, do you see any of these as addressing primary hurdles to affordable housing, or do you think these are sort of addressing things at the margins?
I do think that they are addressing some of the important issues. Because we're talking about the Brownfield cleanup program and brownfields here, I think it's important to note that unless I missed it, none of these reports, and especially the mayor's report, as extensive as it was, none of them focused on the Brownfield cleanup program or brownfields in general as a key component and really as a key supply source of real estate on which to build affordable housing. It's just not in there. And to me, that's a significant oversight. The Brownfield cleanup program works because it brings in certainty in environmental cleanup and it de-risks the health, safety, and economics all at the same time. And if you can coordinate that program with the benefits of a 485X or a 421A, and you can make the approvals and incentives line up together, brownfields as a source for developing affordable housing is something that I think the mayor's task force needs to recognize, and I think the governor's office needs to recognize. And I think that there are changes that can be made in brownfield cleanup incentives at the state and maybe even at the city level that could help move us past, as Justin was saying, move us into the area where we know we all agree on some of the objectives. This could be a mechanism for achieving those agreed upon objectives. It already is to a degree, but I think it could be made so to a much greater degree.
Right. I wonder if each of you could just say maybe one thing that you're watching closely over the next 1 to 2 years that you think could materially change the affordable housing development landscape in the city.
I think that new legislation that allows for large scale affordable housing projects is going to be the thing to watch for. I think that there could be an onslaught of more just like 100% affordable housing projects and finance projects by the city and state. I just don't think that there is enough to get built. And it's just funny, we're on a call right now, and I think I just saw like something about Trump refusing to sign the federal affordable housing legislation that's up. So I guess maybe that's not where it's going to come from unless there's more to that. But I think that hopefully in 2027, post-election, there'll be some more thought on how to come up with better legislation to target large-scale affordable housing projects. So I would be keeping an eye on that and whether or not they actually will be able to do more, city and state funded stuff. I just don't know if the budget is really there to make a real impact.
I would agree with that. I mean, we've talked about the benefits of building on brownfield sites, but no matter how you look at it, the tax benefits and the legislative fixes that need to be made to incentivize affordable housing. Yeah, you could place some of that into the brownfields program. For example, you could sweeten the tangible property credit and bring it back more closely aligned to where it was pre-2015 and just allow people to get 100% of the benefit of building an affordable housing project instead of just the percentage that's attributable to affordable housing. But it's going to take legislative changes. Bottom line, you need legislative changes if this is going to work.
Great. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. So thank you both, Justin and Michael, for your time today.
Awesome. Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me. This was great.
The content of this podcast and its supplemental material is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers in their individual capacities and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Side Padgett and Rizal and/or any of the clients they represent.